Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this Wildlife and Countryside Link Roundtable on 30 by 30. There's a lot of talk at the moment about the importance of private markets and blended finance and driving corporate money into nature's restoration and the tsunami of investment that will follow if we get that kind of private market rallied round to help support nature's recovery. And that's why I was very interested really to find, while looking through the Dasgupta review of the economics of biodiversity, a really important section that talked not about markets, not about economics, but about the importance of remembering that sometimes private markets just don't do the job, and always the importance of area-based conservation measures, the old approaches of being able to designate particular areas of our countryside and our seas to be protected and enhanced for wildlife will remain important, even if we get those economic signals and private investment rights. Area-based conservation measures remain one of the most powerful tools that we have to bring to bear on the problem of turning around the state of nature. And that's why it was fantastic last year in September to hear the Prime Minister himself say that the UK would lead in protecting 30% of our land and sea for nature. This was a really important commitment, and one that speaks highly in advance of COP15, the Convention on Biological Diversity talks next year, where we're hoping that 30 by 30 will be one of the preeminent implementation mechanisms for turning around and halting nature's decline by 2030 and creating an economy that works in harmony with nature by 2050. The problem, of course, came in the second paragraph of the very same press release that announced the government's intention to do 30 by 30, when it said that the government had already reached 26% of the UK protected under existing designations. So that meant SSSIs, SACs, SPAs, and of course, AONBs and national parks. In the report that we've released today at Wildlife and Countryside Link with our partners around the conservation sector, we cast a light on that claim that 26% of the UK is already protected for nature. And we question whether those existing designations are enough, not just to halt damage to nature, but to turn it round and start to drive nature's recovery. And we apply two tests. For something to be counted towards 30 by 30, it needs to be protected in the long term against harm. So legal protection against intensive management of the land or against development. And it needs to have long-term legal provisions in place to provide for positive management for nature's recovery. And unfortunately, much of that 26% that the government is relying on doesn't meet those criteria. Most obviously, in the designated landscapes, we find that large areas aren't managed for nature's recovery. They were never intended to be. But even in places like SSSIs, we find that areas haven't been managed well for nature. And in lots of cases, we simply don't know the condition that sites are in. A truer reflection of how much of that 26%, how much of our land and sea meet the criteria for 3030, we think is more like 3 or 4% on land and at sea. The RSPB did some scientific work last week and they published a report famously generous. The RSPB thought not 3 or 4, but 5% might meet the grade. But whatever number it might be, we're talking a handful of percent and not the sort of cusp of success that the government has claimed. Now you can imagine a minister sitting in DEFRA looking at this report that we've put out today and putting their head in their hands. Conservationists, they always come back and say, yes, but, yes, but, yes, but. And it could almost be a report of despair to see that we're only suggesting we're on 3%, but it's not intended to be. The point we're making today is that the designations that are already in place provide the foundations for success from 30 by 30, but we mustn't be locked in a false accounting trick that gives us a false sense of security. Instead, we need to work to invest and improve those designations that are there. What should that be? We suggest that in the core of the network, the SSSIs, SACs and SPAs, we need to finish off the network. At the moment, it's a representative network of parts of those important areas. We need to designate more, and we need to strengthen them to make it absolutely clear that chancing at applications from development just aren't on anymore. Those protections need to be sacrosanct and strengthened. We think that could make between 10 and 16% of the network. Then the AONBs and national parks, these are really important designations, but they're not fit for purpose for nature at the moment. And that means consciously changing the purposes of those designated landscapes to provide for nature's enhancement, and providing the powers that the management bodies need through their management plans to actually bring the measures into effect that will be needed to improve nature. And of those areas, we think maybe 30–40% could contribute actively to the 30 by 30 promise. And that leaves another 10% or less to be filled. And there we need to look to innovative approaches, things like strengthening the designations for local wildlife sites, things like the brilliant ideas for environmental improvement areas or wild belt, or a layering of other existing measures to provide that we meet those two tests of long-term protection against harm and long-term management for nature's recovery. So in the report today, we are critical of the government's claims so far. We're critical of the accounting trick, but we're not critical of the promise. And we are, we hope, constructive in putting forward some suggestions for how the government can actually turn things around and meet 30 by 30 in a credible way. And it's hugely important as we reach the end of this COP year and turn towards Kunming in China early next year, because 30 by 30 will be at the heart of the delivery of the promise to turn around the state of nature. And if we don't set a standard for what good 30 by 30 means, who will? We've seen twice before the world agree global targets to turn around nature's recovery. This time, we need to show that we understand it's about implementation and that we'll take 30 by 30 seriously and set a global standard for what it could look like. So with that, I'm delighted to welcome our panel of expert speakers to discuss this in more detail. We have Beccy Speight, who's Chief Executive of the RSPB. We have Joan Edwards, Head of Public Affairs, Policy and Advocacy at the Wildlife Trusts, and Tony Juniper, long-time nature campaigner and thought leader in our sector and currently chair of Natural England. So we'll turn to each of those in turn for contributions before opening up for questions. Before I do so, I'd just like to thank Emma Clark on the Wildlife and Countryside Link team, who leads our planning and policy work and has done such a tremendous job in the thinking and writing and everything to do with bringing together the report and the partnership around it today. So over to you, Beccy. 30 by 30, how is the government doing and what can it do to help us get there on land and at sea?
Thanks, Richard. And I think it's a great report, and I do commend it to everyone who hasn't had the chance to read it yet. The report that's come out today is absolutely great in that it sets out that whole scene that Richard talked about. And you know, when you look at things like you know, the state of nature report that we do on kind of, you know, species across the UK, you know, you can see that we're at a terrible kind of state of affairs, really. So we've got 41% species in decline, we've got 15% at risk of extinction, and that's just in the UK. And we know around the world there's 1 million species at risk of extinction. So it is fair to say that efforts to date, you know, have failed to halt the loss of species, much less reverse it. So, you know, we are not in a good situation. And you could say, well, we've had protected areas, so they jolly well haven't worked then, you know, it's failed. But actually, when you dig into all of this, you can actually see it's a much more complex picture. And one of the things I love about, you know, the current thinking that's going on, you know, driven by probably originally the Lawton Review, is this idea that actually we need a complex web to respond to what is a complex problem. And I think that's really interesting, and we'll explore that, I'm sure, today. We need a complex web of protection. But, you know, the thing I want to talk about today is these things that sit right at the heart of whatever that web turns out to be, and they are our protected areas. So these are are the final refuges of some of our most rare and vulnerable habitats and species. And when you look at the facts, you know, there's real clarity around this. So if you look, if you take birds as an example, which is something that the RSPB is absolutely passionate about, you know, you can see across the facts that birds which benefit from special protected areas do better in the countries that have them than the countries that don't have them. Okay, so that's just facts. And, you know, and they do better in countries that have more and bigger protected areas as well. So that's a sense of scale, quantity, it's really important. And actually, whether or not a species benefits from protected area protection is a more important determinant of its conservation status than any other factor that we've been able to test, and that includes vulnerability to climate change. So, you know, protected areas play this really crucial role as the jewels in the crown, if you like, the kind of the heart of the web of protection in order to kind of try and change this crisis. So that's quantity and some of the evidence around quantity. In terms of quality, you know, the peer-reviewed science paper that Richard referred to, which the RSPB team put out just last week, makes clear that only just under 12% of UK land is currently primarily protected for nature. That's the important thing, that nature is coming at the top of the pile, and that, as you know, as Richard said, as little as kind of 5% we think of that is being effectively managed for nature. And it's those two things. So it's not just quantity that really matters, it's quality as well. And actually, if you move from land onto seas, then you can see that the proportion of seas protected is greater on the surface of it. We talk about 40%, but actually very little of that is being effectively managed or monitored. So, you know, it's the quality as well as the quantity that really matters. So what are we going to do about it? Right. So to recover nature and work towards this kind of nature positive trajectory that the government is setting out, you know, it's clear that protected areas will be vital because it's where nature will be recovered from quite a lot of the time. So they provide this kind of almost arc in a way at the moment of where these species can recover from. And, you know, the UK has made this Leaders Pledge for Nature in terms of 30 by 30. It's set this species target now for halting decline in the Environment Bill, which we were really delighted to see. But there is a big gap between, you know, that trajectory, that kind of pledge, that aim, and what is really going on at the moment. And so we estimate that on land, we're going to need about a 3 times increase in the area protected primarily for nature. And, you know, on both land and sea, these areas need to be so much more than paper parks, which is always the risk that we just draw some lines on maps and we think that's it. Actually, these need to be managed to drive recovery and monitored to check that it's working. So management and monitoring are really key. And, you know, again, I kind of go back to that Lawton review in 2012, when it was really clear, you know, Lawton said we need bigger protected areas, better managed, better connected to drive nature's recovery. And that feels really crucial. That's almost the most exciting bit I think we can think about at the moment. And, you know, we need to think about how we go beyond those protected areas as well. And again, there's some really interesting thinking going around that at the moment. So what could this mean? So, you know, in the RSPB science report, we said, you know, future targets and indicators need to focus on quality as well as quantity of protected areas. And today's report from Link, you know, basically says, look, there's no point doing some accountancy and, you know, and counting in land and sea that's not primarily protected for nature. It just doesn't do the job. So it needs to be effectively managed for its recovery. And, you know, it needs to be either recovering or already in good condition for nature. That's the quality piece. So that's where you can set some standards around quality. So what should we do? Well, number one, we should sort out the condition of the sites we already have. Okay, so we have sites that are already protected that are not in good condition and not in recovering condition. So that means we've got to monitor them. We've got to know that, first of all. We've got to get to grips with the issues, and we've got to put in place the right management to get them into better condition, and monitor again to make sure that is succeeding. And that sounds really, really dull. It's the kind of, this is the bread and butter of good conservation. And, and it costs money as well, but we shouldn't shy away from that, because that will sit at the heart of having a much more effective protected area network. And we've got lots of the mechanisms we need, they are in place, but we need to make sure that we use them. Secondly, we should level up. Okay, so I think one of the things that is wrong with our protected area network at the moment is it's really confusing for people to understand. Those who are non-conservationists will kind of look at these different designations and kind of think, what the heck is this telling me? So I think you could do something around how you kind of talk about the network and how you label it. But the most important thing will be to level up to the highest standards of protection. Not all of our protected network has those highest standards at the moment. And the green paper, of course, that's coming through at the moment, plus we've got the planning bill coming through as well. These are both opportunities to really get this right. And, the proposed changes to the HABs regs, which is what we're talking about today, really provide that opportunity if we get that right. And it's that, to be honest with you, this is a key test of whether we really mean it when we say we want to see 30 by 30. Are we taking this seriously? Are we being honest about the situation we're in now? And are we going to put in place what we need to put in place to get there? And in England, the most recent special area protection review still needs to be looked at. That highlights the gaps, so we could fill those gaps. And NE conducted a review of triple SIs. We should dust that off, look at that as well. This would give us where we need to actually increase the quantity and move from kind of 8 to 10, ultimately to 16%, we think. And then we need to think about how we protect areas that have the potential for recovery. So that would be about protecting those that already give us that kind of that bedrock of protection. But think about those where we've got the potential for recovery as well. And that's where we think things like the national parks, the AONBs could absolutely play a role, a really important role. It's also where there could be new mechanisms to really kind of make sure we've got those recovery areas being protected as well. And I know Joan's going to talk about that in a moment too. So basically, I think there is a route through this. There is a route by which we could arrive at something really strong. But if we start fiddling around with it too much, and if we don't have that trajectory of really trying to increase quantity and increase quality at the same time, then we really will have blown the opportunity we've got to make 30 by 30 absolutely real on the ground and at sea. And our protected areas and our protected area network absolutely sits at the heart of that, and we fiddle with it at our peril.
Thanks so much, Beccy. Good message to end on. Just a very quick question. In the previous text of the CBD agreement, thinking about what you said about levelling up, there was an idea that we should have 10% that's strictly protected, to give people that idea that there are sort of areas where it's almost hands off. But there was a worry that that meant that the other areas shouldn't be, would be left with a lesser degree of protection. And that's one of the reasons why it was taken out. Do you think that's a useful way of thinking about it? Or is there a risk that by saying strict protection areas, that the implication is that other areas can still be damaged and harmed?
Well, the thing that I wrestle with, Richard, is how much of the time of the conservation sector as a whole is spent at the moment on defending what are supposed to be protected areas. So much of our energy goes into casework or kind of, trying to kind of, rectify kind of damage and degradation that's being done. So I do think that absolute kind of protection, would play a really important role in terms of us just being able to apply that capacity to kind of absolutely driving forward a much more kind of forward trajectory around our conservation work, rather than having to always play a defensive position around it. So I think that could be helpful, not only for us and for conservation efforts, but also for developers, for those who kind of will punt in, in the hope of kind of making a successful development, for example. But I do think that is something we do have to watch for, that you get that kind of, oh, well, those are really sacrosanct, but actually the rest of it's up for grabs. And that's where kind of real clarity, I think, over the whole network would be really, really kind of useful. And I think that's something that I'm hoping will come forward out of this green paper.
Brilliant, thank you. Joan, Beccy's talked about the jewels in the crown. I think you're going to tell us about the future riches. So those areas where there's great potential for nature, if only it could be given the opportunity to thrive again, as well as, of course, thinking about the marine environment.
Of course, thank you, Richard. As Becky has said, we are in trouble, really. It's not a green and pleasant land anymore. Numbers of many species are in freefall. Rich wildlife habitats are fewer and smaller and less connected than they've ever been. And many wildlife sites are, we know, damaged by poor management, neglect, inappropriate development, pollution, or disturbance. And I might sound quite negative, but that is the situation. We've only recently seen the Environment Agency reduce regulations on pollution on land. We know that many of our marine protected areas are being fished by damaging fishing activities. So we do have a problem. And at the same time, we face both a climate emergency and a nature crisis. And we are becoming more and more aware that our existence depends upon a healthy natural environment. That's why it's so important that we commit to this target of 30% of land and sea for nature by 2030. And that's only 8 years' time. It means reimagining how we use our land and turning away from business as usual. It's an ambitious goal, but one which is absolutely vital for our future. Luckily, progress, as Richard and Becky said, is already to be made, and policymakers are taking up the 30-30 mantle. The UK government has just amended the Environment Bill to include a legally binding target that will commit them to halting the decline in biodiversity by 2030. This is really exciting to see 30 by 30 heading onto the statute books 10 years after the Lawson Review, where he said we need more, bigger, and joined up areas for nature. But to reach that 30 by 30 goal, we need to think big. Currently, we argue, is it 5%, 6%, 12% of our land in England is designated as national or international protected areas for conservation. It doesn't really matter what that figure is. It's not 30%. So it's nowhere near enough. So we really need to do something different. In fact, we as a Wildlife Trust believe we need a new land designation in England, which specifically supports nature's recovery. One that goes beyond protecting the nature we have to protecting the space that nature needs for the future. And we want to call this Wild Belt. So a Wild Belt would enable land that is currently of low biodiversity value to be designated for nature's recovery at a small or large scale, speeding the creation of the Nature Recovery Network. And when we talk about a belt, we don't mean a belt around a city. We need a belt running through the city, around the city and into the rural environment. And we need nature everywhere. We all know that nature is good for mental and health, and everybody should have access to nature. At the moment, land in England that is recovering cannot be protected. The Wild Belt designation would safeguard this land from development, allowing wildlife the time and space to flourish in order to benefit future generations. It's just not on land that designations can be used to set our path towards nature's recovery and climate stability. Our seas have a vital role to play in the fight against climate change, but they can only do this if we help them thrive first. That's why the government's commitment to a new designation, highly protected marine areas known as HPMAs, is so exciting. HPMAs are a new marine designation. They will be the gold standard for marine protection, offering the strictest possible environmental protections. The introduction of HPMAs has been a real victory for the Wildlife Trust, marking 3 years of campaigning from our staff and over 10,000 of our supporters. But we need more than a handful of pilot sites, which is what the government is currently considering. Which is why, actually, we were pleasantly shocked 2 weeks ago when the Scottish government announced they're going to designate 10% of their seabed as HPMAs. I call upon this government in England to commit to the same target. But there is still work to be done to ensure HPMAs fulfill their potential. Progress made on them shows how much can be achieved if government, NGOs and the public work together to protect the climate and nature. But time is running out to tackle the climate and ecological emergencies, which is why protecting 30% of our seas, 30% of our land by 2030 is such an important target to meet. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Joan. And that was a really helpful clarification point there for anybody who's heard about wild belts, who thought that, you know, it might just go around the edges of cities or something, who wants to have their local park as part of the wild belt. It's more a Jackson Pollock than a belt, is it?
Yeah, I think we use the term wild belt because, you know, it was a real political decision, really, because we know that the Labour Party put forward the green belt, and obviously the Conservatives have the blue belt, and we felt wild belt could join the group, really. So it's just a catchy term, really, but it's, you know, what we want is nature recovering everywhere, and everybody should have access to those nature areas.
Brilliant. Thanks, Joan. Tony, the future of natural England has got to be about mapping nature's recovery from the bottom up and doing all the land use planning that can make the nature recovery network come to life, hasn't it? And you've been a real champion for that. So how do you see 30 by 30 mapping across for that nature recovery network? And will it be Natural England's role to be the guardian of 30 by 30 being real and effective?
On the first part, Richard, you know, the complementarity between ambitions for a nature recovery network and 30 by 30, they should be one and the same thing. As to who's going to stitch all this together, I think that's still work in progress, and maybe we can talk about some of that later on as to how best, you know, to do the delivery, because the targets are one thing. And assuming we all agree that they're worth pursuing, the question then becomes how and who. And, you know, that would be worthy of a little bit more consideration here, I think. I wanted to start today, though, and I was just reflecting on the conversation to date, with just some thoughts about the idea of nature, right? Because, you know, sitting in Natural England, and this has really struck me in the 2 and a bit years I've been there, is the extent to which we often find ourselves speaking at cross purposes with people about what we mean by nature. And so today, and indeed in that very press release you mentioned at the beginning, you know, the words biodiversity and nature, they're both in there and they coexist and they're used interchangeably, when in fact, you know, quite a lot of other people are thinking something slightly different. And so we actually reflected on this at the Natural England board in terms of, well, what do we mean by nature recovery? What actually are we trying to put back? And we came up with 4 things that we thought we need to have in mind. So the first thing is the biodiversity, the animals and plants and microorganisms characteristic of a particular geography combined in an ecosystem that's functioning, whether it's natural or semi-natural. That's one piece of what nature recovery is. Simultaneously, we want to have beautiful places. And just think about it for a second. When you go bird watching or go out looking for wildlife, it's not as nice on the edge of an industrial estate as it is in a beautiful piece of coast with gorgeous scenery. And so the beauty sits full square with the biodiversity as a value which coexists with it. And, you know, ideally the two would be done together. And then thirdly, and increasingly, we have ambitions to restore ecosystem services. And so we want those beautiful places that are rich in wildlife to be catching carbon. We want them to be reducing flood risk. We want them to purify the rivers. And we want them to be of enormous public benefit for health and well-being, psychological and physical well-being. So all of those benefits we get from healthy nature. And then the fourth thing, and this actually is highly important in some landscapes, is the extent to which we're also protecting and enhancing historic and cultural heritage. So I was in the Lake District last week, just absorbing some of the complexity that comes in that landscape, where there is an ambition to do recovery of biodiversity, but against a backdrop of a landscape that's been designated for its historic values, its cultural values, its beauty, its role in art and literature, and all of which, for those people who advocate the protection of those values, they mean nature. They think that's nature. And so a couple of reasons for mentioning this spectrum of values as to what nature recovery might be all about. The first thing is to emphasize the extent to which there might be lots of fellow travelers, if only we can capture this in the right way, including people campaigning for the protection of the World Heritage Site in the Lake District, for example. If we tell them, you know, that nature recovery is about what they're after, rather than saying that the national parks and the AONBs are not biodiverse and therefore not part of 30 by 30. We're kind of potentially missing something of an opportunity there. So I think if we try and have that more holistic view as to what we're trying to achieve, it could be that some of the things at the moment which we see as slightly kind of detracting from 30 by 30, i.e. do we include the national parks and the AONBs, actually, by taking a broader view, we might be able to stitch together a stronger coalition of interests. And just think for a moment, you know, some of the places that capture all four of those values at once. So the hay meadows in the Yorkshire Dales, they're inside a national park because they're beautiful. They are deemed of enormous importance for biodiversity. They're an SAC because of the plant and insect communities, plant communities, I believe, principally, also of great importance to breeding waders. They are of enormous historic and cultural significance, which is one of the reasons why they finished up in the national park to start with. And also they're reducing flood risk in downstream towns and cities because of the way in which those soils absorb water. And so I think, you know, taking that broader view of how we might encapsulate the benefits of 30 by 30, I think for us at Natural England is an increasingly important opening thought, really, and gives us opportunities to be working in much stronger common cause with the people who are running the designated landscapes. So I just open with that thought, and it kind of then naturally leads into what was being said a moment ago by Joan and Beccy about the need to go beyond, you know, a numerical target, 30%. It's great and everyone can see the point of that from an ecological point of view, but, you know, the quality piece is essential to have here. You know, and one of the things that we observe at Natural England, and you all observe in the NGOs quite correctly, is the extent to which our SSI network at the moment is not really in the state that we would like it to be. You know, under half of it is deemed to be in a favourable condition. So designating a load more of unfavourable habitat may not necessarily be the top priority, when in fact, you know, we could simultaneously be blending in the question of quality at the very beginning. And so I kind of add that thought to what's already been said as being essential. And on top of quality is this question of where it all is, you know, having 30%, if it's all in one block in the corner, is that right? Or do we want to have an ecologically coherent network running across the entire nation, which would blend in thoughts like wild belt amongst other things? And of course, it's the latter for all the reasons that we know from John Lawton's groundbreaking work and others. And we do have tools coming forward to do that in the form of local nature recovery strategies. Now, as those local nature recovery strategies come forward, we're probably going to see, well, we will see opportunities for quite a lot of new habitat creation. And this is when I come to the thought, and this is something which is blended in to how the CBD talks about this 30% idea, the notion of other effective area-based conservation measures, i.e. things that are going to contribute to that 30%, but may not necessarily be a SSI or a national park or other designation. And, you know, I'm instantly drawn to the NEP example. You know, it's not a SSI, it's not a national nature reserve, but isn't that an incredible example of what nature recovery can look like? And so how do we blend in much, much more of that, including through some of the policy that's going to come, landscape recovery, local nature recovery, and put those into a mix, which is going to be building that national nature recovery network through these new local nature recovery strategies, but which not only is going to be using the new ELM policy to encourage more kinds of NEPs, but also will be blended in with the opportunities we've got from biodiversity net gain, also the work that's going on, for example, with peatland recovery, and also the ambition to expand woodland and how we put that into an ecologically coherent network that might well finish up contributing to that 30%, but might not necessarily be inside a SSI or other statutory designation. So that stitching together, of course, is going to come in the opportunities for that will come in the wake of the Environment Bill being passed and the local nature recovery strategies being established as processes that will drive that bottom up recovery agenda. And in parallel with that, we also have other really quite significant pieces of policy making coming. So one is going to be the response to the Glover review, which I sincerely hope will be an opportunity to do what I described at the beginning in terms of how you bring all four of those values of nature together in one landscape. So how do we bring up the quality of nature in all four respects in those places which presently, and quite rightly has been pointed out, don't have as much nature in the form of biodiversity as they might or ideally would have. So we've got opportunities there, and also the green paper that's coming, which I'm hoping will lay the foundations for a new era for conservation in this country. And just to characterize, the old era and the new era. So the old era was hanging on to the last remnants of what we had, and the SSI network has done something to achieve that. But the new era is about recovery at scale, and this 30 by 30 piece is very much a part of that. So getting that right and having the right architecture coming through there that doesn't abandon what we've got, but develops it and evolves it into this new place. There's a massive opportunity going to be in front of us in that space, and opportunities to start thinking more broadly about how we approach all of this. Just one final thought in a discussion around targets and timetables. Let's just really not forget the challenge of implementation and how this is going to go, and what's going to be required to do it. And I just kind of have in my mind over recent days the example of the health service, where we've had targets and timetables for, waiting lists and people's treatment and everything else. And it very quickly turns into a discussion about resources, which then turns into a real discussion about how to pay for it. When it comes to nature, we have a very good discussion about targets and timetables, a good discussion about policy, but very rarely do we get onto the top of the agenda the discussion about the resources. And so we can have as many targets and timetables and policies as we like. If we don't have the means to follow through, we won't achieve it. I just leave you with that thought.
Great thought to finish on, and I hope there are some Treasury officials listening. We'll certainly be making the case in our CSR bids that you can't do 30 by 30 properly unless you've got the investment in nature, investment in monitoring and all those things, as well as the habitat creation itself. And that was brilliant on the need for nature recovery outside the network, Tony. Just to test one thing you said a little bit more. I mean, Campaign for National Parks have been really heavily involved in this report. And like them, we think that the designated landscapes serve a tremendous purpose for beauty and cultural heritage and all those things, irrespective of the biodiversity bit. But that doesn't detract from the fact that they don't necessarily do the biodiversity debate across their whole landscape. And so the 30 by 30 idea came from the CBD.
Yes,
it came from biodiversity. So yeah. Do you not see a bit of tension there about the idea that we could include the whole of those designated landscapes, even if it's not their purpose?
Yeah, well, the tension goes back a very long way. It goes back long before even the CBD was ever thought of. It goes back in this country to the 1949 Act, and in the United States and other countries goes back a long way into the foundations of protected areas and why they were being established. And in 1949, in this country, we went down two parallel paths at once. On the one side, the designation of national parks for beauty and access, and on the other, the national nature reserves and the sites of special scientific interest for biodiversity or nature conservation, as we called it in those days. And those parallel tracks have brought us to where we are today, where we still have beautiful places with dry stone walls, but not necessarily the wildlife that we would like to see in those same landscapes, because the regime has prioritized two different things in parallel, and keeping them connected and bringing them together to lead to integrated outcomes, I think is a remaining challenge. And Julian Glover's review picked up on this in the extent to which ideally we would have more biodiversity in the national parks. And this was one of the reasons for the establishment of Natural England back in 2006. I was not involved with the detail of that at the time, but colleagues who were involved say that the idea was to create an integrated agency, and indeed it was a merger. between English Nature at the time and then the Countryside Agency, amongst other things. And so it was an attempt to bring these two things together. But subsequently, due to funding cuts, the job of then uniting these two pieces of historic activity into one agenda never occurred. But this is the moment when we could draw that together. And, you know, the opportunity, I think, is, you know, yes, it's right to say that we could and, you know, ideally should have more biodiversity in the national parks and the AONBs, but perhaps the way we get stronger momentum and people working in common cause is to point out how we can pursue these things together, rather than saying that, you know, one particular landscape designation is deficient in a particular respect. Actually, what I would say is quite a lot of the triple SIs are pretty ugly and could be more beautiful, but we'll have that for another day.
That's a good one too. And I should emphasize that, you know, we're definitely not saying designated landscapes are deficient. Sure, that brings me on to a question that Guy has posed in the questions here. Guy Shubsholes from Rewilding Britain says, would the panelists agree with one of the key recommendations of the report that for national parks and other landscape designations to count towards 30 by 30, government must update their statutory purposes to include nature recovery, empower national park authorities to deliver this through strengthened management plans, and require public landowners to help deliver this? So that's the question of how to bring those two together in, yes, in the rules.
Well, that's something we're looking at and do agree with. You know, is it time to look at the statutory purpose again and to be thinking about some of these linkages, and also to be thinking through how it might be possible to create new outcome frameworks for the designated landscapes to work with their partners to be able to drive towards these more integrated outcomes. So those kinds of ideas are certainly in the mix. Question is, where do we land them? And I kind of then draw us back maybe to you know, the government's response to the Glover review and also this green paper.
Thank you. But Becky,
if I can just come in on that, Richard, so I think the other thing is the funding, of course. You know, I mean, you know, I have good friends and who work in national parks and AONBs, and you know, they are like a coiled spring in terms of wanting to do more for nature, yes, but actually, yes, you know, have lacked the funding to do that, as well as the kind of the purpose, obviously, which Guy refers to, and so I think that is a really key piece of it. You know, so many of my colleagues, particularly in national parks, you know, a huge amount of their capacity goes towards just dealing with planning issues. You know, yeah, that's what they're doing day in, day out, which is not why we set up national parks. So I think, you know, that response to the Glover review needs to be really deep and really fundamental, I think, in order to kind of set the right forward trajectory. And I think you know, national parks and AONBs are, as I say, keen to do this. They really want to do this. Some of them are doing a lot already, but they're really keen to do more, and that's going to be key to it.
Certainly.
This brings us on to Colin Beale's question, which is also about funding, and I'd be interested in your take on this, Joan. So Colin asks, in a world of scarce resources for conservation funds, should they be spent focusing on those 30% prioritised for nature, or in the 70% that most of us live in, and who should decide? Maybe the answer is to make the funds less scarce, but what do you think, Joan?
Well, yeah, I'd start there. You know, we're in a situation where we're facing climate crises, and nature crises, and probably a mental health crises after we get out of COVID. And, you know, nature is so important, and we just haven't been investing in it enough. And I sort of take an example of what's happening in the marine environment. So in the marine environment, we've got protected areas, but we also have a thing called good environmental status. And that means outside of your marine protected areas, you should be looking at all the rest of the seas. You shouldn't be just focusing on the 30%. You know, you need nature to recover everywhere. You know, you can't say that bit's special so you can trash the rest. We've got to ensure our farming, our forestry, our fishing are sustainable. Because, you know, we need more than 30%. In some ways, we need nature recovering everywhere. So I agree with Colin, we need more money. And we need to do it everywhere, unfortunately. And who should decide? Well, I think we should decide. You know, it's our future. You know, it's our children's future. We should be shouting out everywhere to say, please put more money into nature. It's absolutely essential.
Local nature recovery strategies are one of the ways that it's envisaged that we, a balance of stakeholders and conservationists and local people should decide, aren't they? And they're expected to be one of the ways of channeling those funds to the places where they can do most good. Does it look like that's going to work at the moment?
I worry. I worry about the funding. And I also worry about who's actually going to do these local nature strategies. The whole point of local nature strategies in some ways is to map where nature could recover and then put that into action. But whose responsibility is it? Is it Natural England's responsibility or is it local authorities? I do worry about local authorities having responsibility for this, but they need to have responsibility to an extent because they are the planning authority as well. But at the moment we know maybe 5% of our local authorities have got ecologists. They've all gone. So in some ways, the first thing we need to do is try and get local authorities to have more capacity. Because my concern is if we left it to the Wildlife Trust, the RSPB and Natural England to do these local nature strategies, great, have lovely, wonderful maps, then a local authority won't probably recognise them and will probably build all over them. So you've got to bring it all together really. We all, collectively, we need to look where we need nature to recover and then we need to protect it for the future.
Tony, did you want to come in there?
Not much to add, really. The local authorities will have lead responsibility on this, and the extent to which they're resourced to be able to do this work in terms of expertise and bandwidth, it will be a material consideration. And then that's when, of course, one gets into conversations around the extent to which 30 by 30 or indeed any of these major environmental goals are going to be delivered without true join up across government. So MHCLG in that case, in terms of local government, needs to be thinking through the resourcing that will go into the local nature recovery strategies and how at the same time, the intent of those can be joined up with wider planning reforms that are coming. Because if we don't have those other government departments seeing that picture of local nature recovery strategy needing to be part and parcel of the new planning framework, then of course we're just going to recreate the problem we've got with a different name, whereby we have development and nature clashing with one another. So that joining up and integration across government is critical, and it goes through to the resourcing of local authorities in the case of this subject we're discussing now, in terms of how we get the local nature recovery strategies resourced and set up properly and then implemented. Natural England, we will play a role and stand ready to help in whatever way we can, technical advice, convening, implementation in terms of drawing forward some of the policy tools that will be there. Work to be done for sure. I have to say though, having been involved with all of this for quite some years now, we can and should highlight these concerns and these tensions, but this is the biggest opportunity I've ever seen coming at us right now. So we need to make the most of it with optimism as well as with anxiety.
Definitely. Hopefully for those local nature recovery strategies, the statutory powers being agreed next week, and then the planning bill making sure that they're properly integrated is the time. So big decisions coming up.
I just come in on that, Richard.
Yeah, please.
Just to say that that point I made about kind of some of the defensive work that has to go on at the moment around our kind of areas that are protected for nature. If we could get clarity and level up in terms of protection, some of that defensive capacity could be turned into this kind of this forward-looking trajectory. So I think that would be a real win, actually. And the other point to make is just, I would, Tony was talking about the kind of the layering of kind of values and the layering of kind of delivery that some of these areas can do for us. And I think that does open up other funding as well and other resources potentially. So I think there is kind of something to be won from that as well in terms of the forward trajectory too.
There is.
Brilliant, thank you. And that brings us on to the next question, actually, a different sort of question of layering. So Tony talked about beauty, heritage, but Louise Payton, asks about whether areas need to be primarily managed for nature or whether we're comfortable with the idea of co-production. So much of the 30% is currently productive farming or forestry. Is it possible to ensure that the 30% is supporting sustainable production, nature and carbon sequestration jointly? You've done some amazing work on the overlaps between areas for carbon sequestration and biodiversity recovery at the RSPB, Beccy. Is it possible to make those join-ups work effectively while still making sure that enough of the 30 is focused on nature, on biodiversity specifically?
Yes and no. So I think the work we've done has been particularly looking at, where our nature-rich areas overlap with our carbon-rich areas, and unsurprisingly, there is a huge overlap. So the potential for some of our most nature-rich areas to also provide some of those nature-based solutions that we need in terms of the climate crisis is absolutely there, and we should absolutely know where those areas are. And it brings us onto the idea of some kind of spatial overview of where we should be trying to kind of get our land to deliver different things. So I think that that's very much where that kind of work has taken us. I think the trepidation I would have, I think absolutely much of our kind of farmland, much of our some of our forestry could absolutely be part of the kind of recovery of nature, so done in the right way, and done in a way that can deliver across the full spectrum of values. They can absolutely form part of kind of nature's recovery. I think where you end up making everything equal, my experience would be that nature always loses out, tends to be the thing that loses out, and that's where you end up with areas that are not primarily protected for nature in reality. They're primarily doing something else, and I think that is the thing that I would have real trepidation about in terms of that approach. So I think there's absolutely a role to be played in terms of that wide recovery and the web that we've been talking about. I think in terms of core protected areas, I would say that those still need to be primarily protected for nature, because our experience would say that without that, you really do kind of lose the heart of the network.
Joan, I could see you were indicating there as well.
Yeah, no, I was thinking, I think, as I said earlier, you can't really go on, it can't be business as usual. But maybe we need to think about it in a little bit of a different way. And I'm just thinking of an area that I live very close to and go to a lot, and that's Dartmoor. Really important for peat, but at the moment it's dried out, and therefore the peat isn't sequestering and it's actually losing carbon. And there are farmers up there, and it might be you pay them to farm in a different way. So in some ways you pay them to farm sphagnum moss. It's trying to get people to live together and actually achieve the functions that we want from these areas, rather than saying, well, you carry on grazing as much as you want and we're trying to do nature, and that's where you get conflict, really. And it may be when we identify these rich areas, we need to think, well, how can people coexist? What's the best way? And for me, if there's going to be farm payments for areas of moor, for example, then why can't they be, rather than paying for sheep, you could be paying them to grow more moss? Just an idea.
Yes.
Thank you. Tony.
This is a really at the heart of it all is what's the most rational use of the land, and how can we maximize multiple beneficial outcomes from a particular land use in any one place. And that goes far beyond even the nature and carbon agenda, really. If you think of what a country like ours needs to do, what we like second or third most densely populated country in the world in England, and 55 million people on quite a small amount of land and sea. And from that, we need to feed ourselves, have housing, have infrastructure, supply energy. We need to get fresh water. We need to catch carbon. We need to restore, not only protect nature, need to create beautiful places for people to be able to thrive and enjoy themselves. Industry, resource production and extraction, whether that's wood or minerals, and you put all those things on top of each other, and it becomes something of you know, a conundrum as to how to get all of them at once. But I think, you know, that the key, and this is, you know, I don't see any kind of immediate prospect for solving this. The key is to get some kind of overview of what the most rational use of our land and sea would be for a secure and sustainable country. And at the moment, what we do is we have a series of binary arguments that are manifest in green belt or housing, rewilding or food, wind turbines or beauty, you know, and so on and so forth. And these battles get played out, and there are winners and losers as a result of these binary struggles very often. And, you know, but we don't make much progress towards answering, you know, the heart of what was in that question a moment ago. You know, can we do multiple things together in one place? Well, the answer is, of course, we can, yes. And we've got good examples of that. But the question of how you optimize it and maximize it is a different thing. One step we could take, and I hope we will, is to have a strong read across between the local nature recovery strategies and the planning bill. That would be a start in being able to have a bit of join up. There we are. Yeah, I'm afraid I don't have an answer, but I can paint a picture of the nature of the challenge, however.
Well, there's a sort of national spatial strategy shaped jigsaw piece puzzle looming at the back of the screen somewhere.
Right.
That's been tremendously helpful, folks. And I think that there are some really strong common themes coming through about the importance of quality management, as well as the raw numbers, about the importance of, frankly, the cash to make it work, and about this opportunity to marry up some of those disparate aspects of nature and environment and beauty into one, with the appropriate change to make it work. I think we're all recognizing, and certainly the report that we published today was meant to be an optimistic report. It's not meant to be a clubbing condemnation of where the government's got to, but a suggestion that it's a foundation for achieving something really special. And having that aspiration there to do 30 by 30 is something that we haven't seen from governments before. And if it really is delivered with those three things, the quality, the money, and the change in powers and management to actually level up and bring some of those designations up to scratch, we could do amazing things. Okay. Equally, it feels like a fork in the road. So there is a lot changing at the moment with habitats regulations and with laws that have been unchangeable for quite some time being looked at again. So I'd like to finish, if I may, with a final turn to each of the panel to give an optimistic view. If you could wish the world down a particular path in the next few weeks to make 30 by 30 go down the path of optimism and excellence, rather than the path hopefully not traveled that leads to more environmental decline, what would your take-home message be for everyone to give us the optimistic view of what this could deliver? Joan, why don't we start with you?
I think I'd encourage everybody to go out and actually see some nature, and then report that back in. We talked an awful lot about nature during the first lockdown. And I know my local park was absolutely packed with people really appreciating the woodpeckers, etc. We need to continue appreciating, enjoying our nature. And then we need to get across that message to the politicians that we think it's important. And a lot of us were talking about how important it was during the lockdown. We sort of drifted away, and I've noticed the park is empty at the moment. We need to get people out there again, especially now we're coming out of COVID.
Thank you. It's a good message to everyone. Block out the next hour in your diary. Get out there. Beccy, what's going to lead us down the path to making 30 by 30 really the amazing thing it could be?
Yeah, I mean, it's the birds, the bees, the butterflies. The potential win is enormous in terms of our landscapes, in terms of you know, the species that surround us, in terms of the way in which we're connected to a world that's not only richer in nature, but which is, you know, we're living more in harmony with. I mean, you know, it all sounds like great hippie stuff, but you know what? That is the future that I want to see. And at the moment, I kind of get a glimpse of it when I go to a nature reserve. I get a glimpse of it when I go to some of our, you know, triple SIs. You know, that should be everywhere. That should be everybody's right, and it should be in glorious abundance. And that's the win that is there for us. It's there for the taking if we're prepared to put the hard graft in, get the funding in place, and really drive for a genuine, you know, 30 by 30 at the very least. And that would just be amazing.
Brilliant, thank you. And Tony, Becky's challenged us for a hippie future. Have you still got any bell bottoms in the cupboard somewhere? What's your take-home message for everyone?
In the cupboard, Richard, I'm wearing them. The thing that gives me enormous optimism is just how the mood on all of this has just shifted over the last 5 years or so. And so again, you know, thinking back to the 90s and before, there was a prevailing narrative in society and politics along the lines of, you know, the price of progress is seen in, you know, the loss of nature. I mean, that was what people thought, that there was a balance to be struck between development and growth on the one side, and then, you know, protecting nature on the other. And whenever you kind of did that balance, nature was always the one that lost out. We've moved into a new era now where we've realized that narrative is wrong, and that by protecting and restoring nature, we get massive social and economic benefits. And so that's been driven by a lot of science, and it's now reflected in policy, and that is different. And now it's not only reflected in those rarefied reports coming from, you know, TEEB and the Millennium Ecosystem and these places, it's now also reflected in the public mood, which I think has opened the door for these big policy announcements, including this 30 by 30. And I think the key now for this next 10 years is to maintain that spirit of, this is really good for us as a society. It's not about stopping things in order to look after the birds and the bees. This is about building something that's going to make us a stronger, more secure and healthier country, economically and socially. And so maintaining that spirit and maintaining a sense of that everybody wants to be a part of that journey. And this is where I just finish with a tiny note of caution about the, you know, drawing lines on maps and designations, and the extent to which that will, of course, be a very important part of what's needed, but not the only thing. And let's make sure that we keep everybody else on board who does want to do nature recovery, but may not necessarily want their land to be designated a triple SI. You know, I pick up some of this now and again, farmers who, you know, they're doing good things. They're in a farmer cluster. They're trying to restore grasslands and bring back birds. And they're worried that they're going to be turned into a triple SI and can never do anything ever again that they might want to do. And yet they want to be fellow travelers. So let's just, I would say, maintain the optimism through keeping everybody on board and as part of the picture. And if we can do that, and you know, that rather unfortunate UN acronym, other effective area-based conservation measures, let's have that there alongside the official designations, because I think we'll get more done.
You know, it's been a cool webinar when it finishes on OECMs. Thank you, everybody, for brilliant thoughts all round. We've got 10 years to get this right. It doesn't need to be finished straight away. So let's make sure that we set out what 30 by 30 can really be a meaningful contribution to nature's recovery. Let's take our time, let's get it right, and look forward to seeing that come through in the planning bill and in the CSR in the days ahead.
Holly's come in. She can hear it drawing to a close. She's come in to take me out.
I just love the way she's put her head on her